The existence of the USSR over many decades unfortunately shows that tyranny can be tenacious, and the extreme barbarism it deploys to suppress freedoms can last a long time and exact a huge toll of human suffering. That is why our weak strategy towards a decisive Ukrainian victory and complacency in the face of a revanchist, totalitarian, even fascistic Russian world ideology is so very dangerous. We underestimate how pernicious, destructive, and long-lived this new wave of illiberal aggression from the Moscow swamplands could be. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. All our content is available also on popular podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, if you prefer to consume it there. Please do also like and subscribe to help new people find our amazing speakers. And of course, if you enjoy the content, do please consider supporting our work by becoming a patron or buy me a coffee. Robin Horsfall joined the British Army at the age of 15 in 1972. He served with the Parachute Regiment and 22 Special Air Service. He left the Army in 1984 and worked as a mercenary, bodyguard, and a medical officer in many active zones around the world. He then built London Karate for 20 years, teaching thousands the art and discipline of karate. He retired and went to Surrey University age 56, graduated English literature and creative writing 3 years later, and is the author of several books, including the hugely successful autobiography, Fighting Scared. And one thing we are going to mention today, he has a new book out. It's a collation of his incredibly insightful and powerful commentary throughout this war, since the start of Russia's full-scale war. I will let Robin describe it in a bit more detail because I'm sure he could do a better job of it than me. Welcome back to the channel. This is I think the fourth time I've had the extreme privilege to be able to welcome you here.
Well, I think it's a privilege to be here as well. It's always good to have an opportunity to talk about something, especially when you've just released a new book.
And this isn't just because you've got a bunch of material and it seems like a nice time to do it ahead of Christmas. I mean, that's great, of course, but I think you're driven by a strategic imperative to get that out now. Could you describe what the book is and why it's so important to have such a resource at the present time?
Yes, Slava Ukraini Who Dare Shares is a combination of obviously the war cry of the Ukrainian people and what's become my key phrase, Who Dares Shares, which is at the end of most of my blogs and writings, and I've become known for that particular phrase. So I combined the two as the title. It's an observational diary, really, of the last 20 months of the Ukraine war, because I was screaming out on public social media before the invasion, saying, what the hell is going on? Nobody seems to be paying any attention to this. Djokovic is getting thrown out of Australia. President number 45 has just tried a coup in his own country, and Boris Johnson's Christmas party are holding the headlines, and 100,000 people. And so I got stuck into writing about it, and then developed this very large following, particularly on LinkedIn, which is a format where people tend to actually read to the last word. And then I thought, well, it's very, very important to keep this in the public eye. We've got this second front that's starting in Israel, and I want to keep the world focused on Ukraine being the key to what's happening geopolitically everywhere. And so I didn't have time to go to a publisher. So I edited and self-published and presented the cover and everything else myself and got it out now. Now, not because of Christmas, which is convenient, but now because the war is at a critical point and the message needs to be out there now. You go to a publisher in 6 months' time, your book comes out, the war's changed. It's a piece of history rather than contemporary work. And so I've got it out now. A lot of interest from the people in Ukraine, a little bit of a gentle approach about translating it to Ukrainian. And it's important to me. And it's been important to me for the last 20 months. And the Ukrainian people need that kind of voice constantly reminding the ordinary guy in the street why he's there, because generals will talk as if they're talking to their senior officers when they're interviewed. Wonderful stuff. It's really, really good if you can understand it. Politicians will dance around the lie and not say what they really think. So the way I try to present my work, and it's natural, not so much deliberate, but natural, is as if I'm talking to a guy who's never been a soldier, never been involved in politics, who wants to understand in short bites what's going on and what effect it has, as if I'm talking to a few people in the pub. And it seems to be extremely popular. So I'm going to keep it going, and maybe by this time next year I'll have a second phase.
I
No
hope so,
volume.
because I think you've added, a lot of value, and you've got an incredibly loyal following on LinkedIn. It's also a medium where people do actually engage with detail. They read articles, they read even long posts. It's a nice distraction from work. You can do your work networking, and you can read about all sorts of other stuff at the same time. However, there has been a tendency for social media to disadvantage people producing content around Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians who are posting the truth about what's happening, posting images of missile strikes and so on, are continuously banned from LinkedIn. There's a high focus of troll activity trying to get people banned. And there's a certain element of fatigue as well, from people who are trying to tune out and stick their heads in the sand like ostriches. How have you combated all of these threats and problems on the primary platform, which is, a very effective place to get the message out, but it does have these inherent challenges?
Well, I've learned to be very, very careful with words. Sometimes you need to imply something rather than to state it directly. You must be very, very careful that the trolls, the paid trolls out there, are not given any ammunition by a mistake, an error. And I have had occasions where posts have been taken down. I've appealed, because it's the algorithm that takes them down. It's only when you appeal that it actually gets read by a human being, and they decide, and it gets put back up a few days later, but the message is out there. But when I understand the reason not to want to put bodies being blown to pieces on video, that's not a great idea, and it has an element of entertainment to it. So stick to an important point. The wonderful thing about LinkedIn, especially, although I'm on Instagram and I'm on Facebook and other platforms, is that it limits you to a 1,250 word outlay, and that makes you disciplined and concise, and you have to get your message across clearly in a very short space of time, which is convenient for the reader too. Very often it's the guy sat in his office in the morning who's just having his tea break, who clicks on, wants to read something, and click back off and go back to work. So yeah. Also, I've had professional attacks on my web pages. My security manager has worked very, very hard. Only 2 weeks ago, we had over 60 attacks from Singapore, as it would happen. They get around the world. They tend to flutter around. One time it's Africa, another time it's Singapore, another time it'll be anywhere but Russia. And so there's a constant paid process of attacking anybody that's supporting Ukraine. And the important thing I would say to people that are in the same situation is don't respond. Just block and delete, get them out of your system, and move on with what you're doing. The big danger is to be distracted and get involved in some kind of personal argument that results in you making a mistake and then having a complaint made about you.
Yeah.
So be
Don't
clear.
Give them the ammunition to be able to do that. YouTube is the same. In the early days of doing this channel, I responded back in quite a robust fashion to things that annoyed me, and you run the risk of having your channel deleted if you engage in that kind of game. Now, I've also found that sometimes you find that, yes, it's a Russian troll, or it's just someone who disagrees with you, but they just happen to be, let's say, a little bit clunky, a little bit aggressive. And there are ways to disarm that and actually engage with that person without having to agree with them. And often they'll turn around and then apologize for their initial aggression. So I think there are ways to moderate and bring humane behavior into social media, rather than just, instantly looking for a fight.
Yeah, there are people that misinterpret your headline and form an opinion without reading the text, and so you'll get, I think you're wrong because, and you say, well, have you read it? If you use a vague introduction often people or never use irony on social media, because even the person who looks at your appeal might not understand that irony. So and try not to use humor except when it's absolutely clear, because so I try to keep away from humor, try to keep away from irony, don't use sarcasm, and don't make personal remarks, and stick to the point, get back to the point, always get back to the point.
Absolutely. That's great guidance. Well, let's turn to the reason why the timing of your book is so important right now. And that really is, and I'm going to be quite direct here, because we really sort of laid it out in the introduction to the video. And it is becoming clearer and clearer that key decision makers, especially in Washington and Berlin, are placing limits on the scale and severity of a Russian defeat. They're not thinking about what is required for Ukrainian victory. They're explicitly thinking that Ukraine cannot have a victory which is too extreme, which is too humiliating for Russia. It's almost as if they are putting the interests of the aggressor ahead of the interests of the victim, and I would argue against our interests as well. Could you comment on that, and whether you also detect signs of this, I would say, rather perverse strategy?
Yeah, I think some of the world leaders, not just, I wouldn't particularly go directly to one, but as an organization, as a conglomerate, they may actually be. What a good idea to let Ukraine and Russia burn themselves out on one another. What a good place to test our weapons, to test our new technology, to get rid of our old stocks, to motivate NATO, to motivate the democracies into supporting our ideology. What a good warning to China this is. And how can we deplete these supposed enemies of our nation without having to put our own people on the ground? And so there might well be some people at the very top looking at that particular aspect of the war. So I think they're wrong. I think that's a dangerous game to play. Any form of prolonging a war, I think there's a certain element of Roosevelt doing that until Hitler declared war upon him in the Second World War. It's a way of depleting the strength of the British Empire at that time and making America a world power. So I can see the logic and the sense to it. But Ukraine must win, because if Ukraine wins, Russia loses. And if Russia loses, Iran loses. And if Iran loses and Russia loses, then you've got a situation where China sits back and says, hey, maybe we'll just wait another 100 years before we worry too much about Taiwan. And Ukraine must win. And I'm constantly pounding this drum and trying to raise public awareness of what is important and the reasons why. It's my solid belief that the convenient attack by Hamas on Israel, the terrible attack by Hamas on Israel, was prompted by Vladimir Putin and the leaders of Iran to create a second front, to give Russia a pause and to spread the war more widely and make people who are worried about escalation more vocal.
And that seems to have worked, and certainly it has distracted. So rather than people thinking that this is a second front that's been opening, rather than thinking that Iran is a close partner of Moscow, and without the revenue that was provided by Moscow, it's unlikely that Iran would either have the confidence or even the resources to support Hamas. Russia doesn't even have to be involved in the detailed planning of the event. However, one should note that the attack was launched on October the 7th, which also happens to be the date when Anya Politkovskaya was murdered, and many other things have happened on that date because it happens to be Vladimir Putin's birthday.
Yeah. I mean, if I've got several old coppers who are old pals, and they over the years they say, I don't believe in coincidences, and I know coincidences happen, but usually when you see a series of things come together at a focal point, such as Israel at the moment, There's no coincidence there at all. And I do get frustrated by the ambivalence of the world media and not actually saying anything that's going to be strong and of importance and say, look, this is wrong. They seem to be focused on speculation, selling product, clickbait, and not actually getting stuck really into the situation. I think the journalists are great. I think the editorial level and the production level above them is where it gets stopped, and I think it gets stopped politically. So people like you and me, who have got this voice on social media and on YouTube and other places, can counter that, because it's one of the few places now where people are starting to search for the truth, which is why I have such a strong following, because I don't have a vested interest in finance. I don't have a vested interest in politics. I have a vested interest in decency.
This is it. Another aspect that worries me, and through your long military career, you may have seen instances of this, and that is where there's a strategic objective, but the costs of delivering it are high. The economic costs, the will that's required to follow through on a strategy, and the resources are high. Then it's incumbent on the politician to explain to the public what level of sacrifice is required and why those goals are worth it. Do you feel that politicians have been dodging that conversation, explaining why Ukrainian victory is important and why the price will be high and why people should be fully prepared to go along with that?
I find that British politicians particularly are disappointing. They seem to have been sucked into a world of public marketing. They're marketing a product all the time. Nobody believes them anymore. Even when they're telling the truth, people can't tell the difference. So they won't answer questions. They won't stand up in a public forum and be face to face with people. They have very limited experience outside of politics. So, and it's numbers that dictate what they talk about and what they care about, rather than what really helps the people, what people really want to know about. Because votes are power, and they've realized that if they can market a cheap product and get 1 million people to buy a hamburger, they don't need to sell steaks. And so that's what they do. That's Britain I'm talking about now, but I think that extends right across the free democratic world, where the whole process is one of marketing, and marketing requires money. And if you want money, then that money's got to come from somewhere who's been lobbying you for a particular return on that money. And so are people in politics doing things for the right reason? I doubt it. And are we going to get a person that comes to the top who says, I can lead you? Well, only when there's big trouble. When the big trouble comes, then we get a strong leader. And when the trouble's over, we get rid of them. We shoot them.
As loath as I am to admit it, because I find that Mr. Johnson's career has generally been led by a high degree of self-interest. But if we go back to your writings on Ukraine, it still stands out, I think, quite prominently, and in contrast to the current political crop, that Boris Johnson did seem to put his neck out quite considerably in supporting Ukraine, whether that was from a mixture of self-interest or other reasons, you know, a historical profile linked with Churchill. There are many, many things, reasons why he may have gone down that route. He did seem to make some fairly, I would even call them courageous opportunities, where he created an opportunity for Ukraine to survive. He created an opportunity by providing lethal defensive weaponry at the right time, before other world leaders did. And in taking that lead, they then sort of followed without the javelins and the NLAWs especially. I've heard, from a military point of view, I'd like to know whether the NLAWs were as crucial as some people are telling me they were, that without that lead and without that crucial capability, Ukraine may not even be in the fight at this point. So let's go right back to the start of your comments there and those crucial early weeks of the full-scale invasion.
Yeah, I've actually admired Boris Johnson's response to this advance on Kyiv. I think he led the whole process in Europe, especially. He motivated people in the USA who were focused on Donald Trump. And I really do think that he had an awful lot of charisma, and he used it extremely well. And he pulled people by the throat into supporting Ukraine when they needed it, absolutely needed it, right at that very, very beginning. Supplying what we had, because we didn't have very much. Our stocks had withered away. One of the pieces I wrote says that, NATO had got fat and lazy, and NATO had got fat and lazy. It was slobbering around Europe, pretending to be an army. Johnson gave them everything we could possibly give, went on the ground, stood next to Zelensky, and pulled NATO together and pulled Europe together. I mean, there's nothing like a common foe to pull people who are arguing together anyway. But Johnson, I think, did a splendid job. And I also believe that there was an awful lot of there was a big desire by Putin to remove him from the equation, because the campaign against him, the personal campaign against him, was long and it was persistent. And it seemed to be unnatural that a newspaper reporter would spend so much time going back to this Christmas drinks affair over and over and over again, and then feeding other little details about his personal life continually over 2 years to remove him from power.
Well,
that's how it appeared to me.
yeah. I mean, I think that's the weakness of the media. I mean, it's a choice, isn't it? Because let's face it, Johnson gave them masses of material, and the cabinet notes that are coming out now paint a picture of absolute shambles behind the scenes during COVID. I mean, whatever the public face of it, behind the scenes, acrimony, chaos, distrust, blah, blah, blah. But it's an editorial decision, isn't it? At the end of the day, it's an editorial decision whether to focus on that issue or to focus on one with a higher strategic importance, a higher global strategic importance. And time again, as we see right now, the media will go for the clickbait. They'll go for the story they can endlessly mine with much more sort of maybe human elements, soap opera elements, dare I say it, rather than looking at the big strategic picture. So it seems to be an overall weakness of the media. So that's Johnson. If he hadn't taken that move, other world leaders, including Biden, may not have followed, because we saw in not enforcing the red lines in Syria, that when Britain decided it was not going to move forward and be involved in enforcement of red lines, then the US caved as well. And that perhaps, I know we're going back to before the period of your book, but the failure to enforce red lines many years prior to that, including in Georgia, Syria, and other places, these are all signals. These are all green lights for the autocrat, for the revanchist to build a long-term strategy to take Ukraine.
Yeah, Georgia, Syria, Crimea in 2014, they all encouraged the bully to carry on doing exactly what he was doing, and to believe that the next stage would be exactly the same. And the next stage was a big shock to them, because essentially they thought they would have a very short operation, put a puppet government back into Kyiv, and the job would be done and over with. They didn't anticipate the response of Zelensky, particularly. They didn't anticipate the response of the new Ukrainian army, with the new technology that they've been supplied with, and how effective that was against old Soviet armored vehicles. And so it got stuck. And the appalling level of planning by their generals, we're just going to stroll in and we're just going to rob the bank, was basically what they're going to do. Oh, didn't we bring any guns? it was a joke, and it was only because Ukraine didn't have air superiority that the whole Russian army wasn't slaughtered on that road, and it had the opportunity to retreat. Because had they had air superiority, there would have been 100,000 dead or wounded people sitting along that road, leaving a marker for history. So, yeah, big mistakes there by the Russians. Big mistakes by Obama, and before him even Bush, and nobody had a clue what was going on under Trump. There was no foreign policy, it would seem, and so Biden came in picking up the pieces. He was trying to deal with the exit from Afghanistan that Trump had decided upon. Should he stop it? Should he carry on with it? At the same time as this threat was appearing in Eastern Europe, and there was a tendency in about 50% of his advisors, I think, not to believe it would happen. So priorities, it's very difficult to be in charge. Everybody knows how the team should play, but nobody wants to be the manager. So it's tough, and we can all be wise in hindsight looking back. Nobody wants to go to war, but sometimes war comes to you.
And I think what was interesting is Biden and some of the intelligence services were actually speaking contrary to most people. They were saying that war is actually quite likely, is more likely than not. If you read almost all the Russian opposition commentators at the time, and I'm not using this in a derogatory fashion, these are people whose information and insight I genuinely have followed for years and actually think is rather good in most instances, all of them were saying, no, it won't happen. And this is quite interesting that, and of course, many Ukrainians also could simply not fathom or believe that a war of this scale is possible in the 21st century. But if we take the Russian opposition, who have built very effective media machines, as well as, I would say, analysis machines, they're far less effective as genuine activists and oppositionists, but they are rather good in the information sphere. All of them were saying it's not going to happen. And these are people who are observing the regime at close quarters, being locked up by it, being chased and hounded and harassed. And yet they did not pick up on how, I would say, repressive and idiotic, to use the word, the strategic decision-making would become, how it would come down to really not being a system anymore, but one of the world's largest countries with a nuclear arsenal, really dependent on the whims and illusions and delusions of one man. So we can't, I guess, blame Western politicians for that. Once it had happened, though, have you detected over this period that Russia has learned any of those lessons? Because we had quite a mobile war last year. This year seems to move much more into, if you're going to be very negative and put the word stalemate on it, I wouldn't normally use that, but Zelensky used that word last week. But certainly we have a far more attritional, high-tech World War I kind of bizarre hybrid this year. Have you detected Russia actually learning any lessons from its huge mistakes of last year?
I think that Russia has learned its lessons where it comes to drone warfare. They've realized the value of drone warfare, and they're developing their own systems. But as far as the actual infantry and artillery and standard conventional units on the ground, they haven't changed very much at all. They still believe that they can win this conflict with attritional numbers, just by pouring more and more people into the fray, in the hope that the enemy will tire or run out of ammunition. And that's not working, because the ammunition supply to Ukraine is sufficient to hold them back. The technology that Ukraine is developing and continues to develop is destroying them before they can move. They are still moving tanks in daylight. They're still moving tanks without camouflage. They're still charging across open fields. They're charging across their own minefields. So the Russian general operational procedure is shambolic at the lowest levels. They don't know how to proceed. They really don't. They're still stuck in systems that were in place in the 1960s, and they haven't learned anything in the last 20 months, except I think in electronic warfare, where they're using their electronic capability to bring down Ukrainian drones. At the same time, the Ukrainians have upped the game. They've started to develop their own ballistic missiles. They've started to develop their own long-range drones. So they're not relying on the rules laid down by the West now. Oh, you can use that, but you can only use it in the combat zone. You can't use it against Russian military targets over the border. So they're moving forward, and they're moving forward very quickly. The word stalemate aggravates me somewhat, because I think, again, it's a word that's being planted to make people in the USA, particularly in the House of Representatives, particularly, say, oh, well, it's all a waste of time. It's a waste of money. Why are we doing this? They're not really important to us, the isolationists and the Putin supporters that exist there. So they've got this strange situation where you've got the world starting to believe that it's all coming to a grinding halt. Well, it isn't coming to a grinding halt. We listen to Petraeus, we listen to Hodges, we listen to Chip Chapman and other people who know about strategic military warfare. They'll tell you this is to be expected. You know, these deep, in-depth defenses that they managed to put in place because of that pause last year. They've got 20-mile deep minefields that you've got to get through. They've got trenches. They've got anti-tank systems in place. So it's hard to penetrate. But I will, if you do get through Slava Ukraini, Who Dares Shares, there's a place in it about 5 or 6 months ago where things seemed to be unlikely that there was going to be a huge breakthrough and wind them up from behind last summer. And I did suggest that maybe they'll settle for taking the left bank of the Dnipro and cutting a piece off so they can create a link to Crimea there. That might be just one of many opinions I put out, and I'm cherry picking it a little bit, but I did suggest that that might be an option with things grinding down towards the mud and the wet of the autumn. But operations will continue. The missiles, the drones, the infantry tactics, the mud won't slow down the infantry, it'll slow down the heavy vehicles. The artillery battles will continue, and the surveillance and intelligence operations will continue. And in the meantime, the Russian economy will continue to diminish. They cannot sell their oil. They cannot export their oil anymore. Their economy is failing. And so all these things combined, you see, and you've got to see the successes. Russia can no longer operate their navy in the Black Sea. The north coast of the Sea of Azov is now under Ukrainian artillery fire. They can't operate there. They've had to move their air force and their helicopters back to Russia. There's a great deal to be said that's successful, and I wish more emphasis was made on that. Big rant.
Yeah, that was exactly the point I was going to put to you, actually, because we've had extraordinary high profile, not just one-off hits, but it seems to be laddering up to a strategy of, as Ben Hodges would say, making Crimea untenable. So not that you just throw your troops into the mean grinder and hope for the best, but you actually systematically, over many months, degrade the key supply routes. And we know that Russia is now trying to build a railway to make up for the loss of what's called, the strategic rail networks that are close to Donbass in order to supply Crimea. That is obviously a great target for HIMARS and ATACMS as well, hint, hint. But they have struck Russian ships, including Uskal, which is the latest, relatively new missile carrier. Extraordinary footage of that. We have the footage of British Storm Shadow and French Scout missiles hitting the Black Sea Fleet, which one doesn't want to glory in these things, but that one really brought a tear to my eye. I like the footage of that. But just the very idea, I think, not only is the media not reporting these extraordinary victories, it's not joining the dots. And expressing that as a strategy. It's also perhaps, and I'd like your view on this, it's not seeing the historical importance of such things. The very idea that a British-made missile would destroy Russia's Black Sea Fleet headquarters, and Crimea and the Black Sea, in the Russian constitution, are Russian territory. In their legal system, it's legal Russian territory. We have supplied arms that is destroying Russian assets. The historical importance of that, the step that we've already taken, perhaps it's just not really being recognized or given the status it should be.
Yeah, I've had a few hot conversations with several journalists who come back to me and say, you know, you're very negative, you don't like what we do, you don't appreciate us. And I say, and they'll use comments along the line of, it's our responsibility to report the news. And I'll say, no, it's your responsibility to report the news responsibly, and you don't do that. Well, we've got to be even-handed. No, you don't. You don't have to be even-handed against murder. You don't have to be even-handed about people that blow up families of women and children in pubs. But you've always tried to take this kind of superior position of morality. But actually what you do is you take a very low position. And I really do get laid into them sometimes. Somebody, I won't name him, got in touch with me asking me to comment on the supposed corruption that was taking place with supplies that were appearing in Ukraine. And I said, well, when you've got huge amounts of money and material being moved in a war environment, there's going to be theft. It's going to happen, but it doesn't make it institutional. And it doesn't mean that the billions of dollars that are being supplied from the USA and from Europe and from other nations as well is being corruptly removed to other operations. Sure, there's going to be thieves and they're going to steal stuff, but it's not going to affect what the whole process is about. And he got most upset with me. He got most upset with me. I said, because all you're doing is you're throwing out the Russian narrative. You're trying to undermine the government of Ukraine when they're at war, and you're doing it for free.
So, I mean, if someone's doing it for money and they're a clear vatnik, I'm like, okay, fair enough. I know what you're about. But when someone of their own volition amplifies a Kremlin talking point, and I know that individual is not on the Kremlin payroll, that's even more annoying in some ways. It's like, that's because you're too lazy to do the thinking. It's because you're recycling a narrative you think your readers want to hear. So neither are you reflecting reality, nor are you actually crediting your own readers with any intelligence. Sorry, another rant. I just,
Yeah.
but apart from that rant, and we'll get back onto strategy. So the Russian economy is an interesting point because Russia is now getting armaments. We've allowed them to build this defensive network by not providing air power in a timely fashion or the armor that would be required to create a war of movement. And that's where we are now. Equally, we have not retooled, or generally we have not upscaled or retooled our factories to produce the amount of armament that's required. We say we will, and the EU has promised to match I think in large part what's being supplied by North Korea. But Jade McGlynn makes a very good point in an article she wrote in CNN, is that we've promised these things, but we are not actually putting into action. The factories are not being built. The production lines are not churning these things out. By an extraordinary irony, the authoritarian Axis has promised Russia this materiel, and they are delivering on it. Now, the dud rate may be higher, but per unit, this stuff is going to cost a fraction of what Western armaments cost, and they are already delivering it in bulk. So what is actually the risk, do you think, that authoritarian regimes supporting Russia will actually outproduce and outperform us over the next 1 to 2 years? And the Russian economy quite possibly can actually survive, albeit not in a great condition, but it could potentially survive and support a long attritional war with allies like those.
I'll focus on one particular point of that, which came to mind recently, and that's that, okay, North Korea is going to supply this much ammunition. That ammunition has got to get to the front line. So there's a logistics issue with getting it to the front line. When it gets to the front line, it's got to be loaded onto vehicles. When those vehicles get to the front line, it's got to go to the guns. The guns are getting worn out. The vehicles are getting destroyed. The logistical links are getting attacked by special forces or partisan groups. So it's not just the quantity of ammunition that can be supplied. It's the whole process of getting it to the gun and firing it. The barrels are getting shot out on these guns. So there's there's far more aspects to this issue than just, oh, we can manufacture this many bombs and you can only manufacture that many bombs. And there is a factory being built here in Wales for the manufacture of ammunition in Pontypool. So that's just one that I know of. The Americans are upping the ante. It's not that easy to switch from plowshares to swords again. You know, they can upgrade it. They've got to get the staff, they've got to get the machinery, they've got to put it together. And that's a process that can't be done in as quickly as many people would like it. But it's not as easy as people think. So it's not, we've got more bombs than you, so we're going to win. It's so where we can't necessarily stop the ammunition being supplied by North Korea, we can hit the transport lines, we can hit the vehicles that carry it, we can destroy the troops that move it, and we can destroy the guns. And the guns are running out of barrels, and they've got to manufacture new barrels as well. So just on that particular piece of your question, because there were too many pieces in there for me to focus on.
I think that's the most important bit there, because of course, just looking at the economics, looking at the sort of parity or disparity, doesn't tell you everything about what's going on. And then, of course, there's the attrition of skills. And this is another interesting area I'd like to put to you, which actually was raised in a recent interview, and that is that it's not that the Russian commanders are not capable of learning from mistakes. I mean, clearly they're human, and they actually have smart people there, although the attritional rate is going to be quite high. The problem that was flagged to me was that the transition of skills and knowledge is patchy, both on the Ukrainian and the Russian side, but what you don't have is as much political interference in Ukraine. What you don't have is people who speak their mind being taken out of the equation. Whereas on the Russian side, there is an intolerance to speaking truth to power, to creating innovation and ideas from the bottom and transitioning them up the vertical. And if you do that and you deploy the wrong tone, let's say, the best that could happen is you're removed from your command. The worst that can happen is you have rather nasty accidents with minefields and open windows. What's the cumulative effect, I would say, on a vertical power structure which doesn't really favor innovation and truth?
Well, the classic example would be Adolf Hitler's interference with his own generals in Russia in World War II, where he decided what the strategic decisions were. And when you had his most senior generals wanting to retreat, wanting to withdraw and suck and extend the Russian logistical lines and restore their positions, he wouldn't let them. No, not one step backwards. And it showed his limitations as a corporal in the Wehrmacht. And so he interfered. And I think you've got exactly the same situation with Putin. A low-grade administrative colonel in the KGB who thinks that he knows what his generals should do. And his generals know that if they disagree with him, they'll be replaced. And if they're replaced, they'll be replaced with somebody who'll do exactly as he says. So, it undermines the whole, all the possibilities that Russia has to extend into a kind of mobile and efficient war machine. They can't do it. They don't have the infrastructure to do it. They don't have the political structure to do it. And I don't really believe that, although some of their people are awesomely intelligent, they don't have the staff college training to operate armies of great size and understand the processes that are required to win. They don't have it. We've got processes that our senior officers go through. They're called Staff College in at Sandhurst, for example, where they go through a 2-year program of learning about these strategies and learning how big armies operate and function, which is why listening to people like David Petraeus, Ben Hodges, Richard Dannett are so valuable to understanding the bigger picture. Listening to people that know what the hell they're talking about. The Russians would do well to listen to them as well.
Fortunately, very few speak English, so they won't be able to do that. Thank goodness.
Yeah, I think Putin being isolated for the 2 years of the COVID pandemic was part of this issue. He's isolated himself from all his people, from all the things that was going on, surrounded himself with yes men, so that they'll only tell him what he wants to hear. And there is some doubt that he actually really knows what's going on in the front line, because they're just going to feed him good news. Otherwise, they get sacked, or as you say, they fall out of 6th floor windows.
And the other challenge, of course, is that we impose our Western rationalism in that we will always look at the cost of a particular strategy, especially the human cost of it. And that is the kind of thinking that Ukraine also deploys. Putin has no such limits. There is no price in human life of his own people which is too high to either protect his own skin or to achieve what he thinks are still achievable strategic objectives. This has been said right from the start by you, by Ben Hodges, and by others, that he will not stop until he is stopped. And unfortunately, do you think that message really is still getting muddled? It's still muddled thinking as to how we deal with Putin?
It was my written belief when the Russian army retreated from Kyiv, they lost the war at that point. And I said that it was only a matter of Putin realizing that, and he still hasn't realized it. But I think that moment is actually coming closer. And I think it's coming closer because he hasn't managed to win this war, and the cash is running out behind his back. And those two things combined, David Petraeus said, we won't see it until the house crumbles. And that will come as a surprise to an awful lot of people, that they'll keep putting up the front, they'll keep pouring in the people, they'll keep murdering his own people until there's no people left, until there's no bullets left, and until, most importantly, there's no money left. And then it'll crumble.
And the last question here, and we'll focus in the very, very last sentence on Ukraine, but you've been observing this conflict right from the start and commenting with some of the most sort of incisive reflections on it throughout. Do you see it as a sort of transitional war in terms of strategy, tactics, technology? Because the death of the tank was pronounced, and yet we see the importance of armor, the importance of a mobile war was the doctrine, but here we see an extraordinary mixture of trenches and drones, a high-tech attritional war, and we also see the perhaps ineffectiveness of Russia's Black Sea fleet, and whether that comments on large ships as platforms, and the role now of missiles, or whether it's more down to Russian incompetence. We're seeing all sorts of extraordinary changes take place. What do you think are going to be some of the big learnings, and what does this point towards future military tactics?
Well, we saw the end of the battleship with the arrival of aircraft carriers. So new technology changes the battlefield. We've seen the weakness of modern tanks against shoulder-fired missiles that can be carried by individual men. We've seen the impending doom of seaborne navies to marine drones that can operate just below the surface. So these big changes are going to create big changes in military thinking and strategies, for at least for forward-thinking generals and politicians. So there's going to be big changes in military strategy after this war, because the one thing about a war is it gives people the opportunity to test their new innovations, their new materials. But the one thing that I've picked up more than anything else from the Ukraine-Russia war is the absolute importance of infantry, the absolute requirement for large numbers of infantry, despite the artillery, despite the guided weapons, despite the smart missiles, despite the drones, is you still have got the man in the trenches, the man with the hand weapons, the man who's going through the battlefield and holding the ground. And it's a weakness in European armies that we've reduced our manpower and our armed forces and our infantry to levels now that, in my personal opinion, couldn't defend Dover, let alone defend the United Kingdom in a full conventional war. And so I hope, I genuinely, seriously hope that somewhere, somebody in government is going to look at this war and say, it's time to expand the British Army back to the BAOR levels that we had in the 1970s. We need men on the ground capable of holding the ground when something like this starts.
And the last question, because I always like to end with Ukraine and the focus on Ukraine, because Russia sucks up the oxygen in any conversation. You'll know that I went to Ukraine for the first time in August this year, ran a conference there, also filmed a very, for me, moving experience, which was filming in a rehabilitation center for servicemen who've lost limbs. That was extraordinarily uplifting. I thought it would be depressing, but it was quite the reverse. It showed the Ukrainian spirit and Ukrainian innovation, and it's probably the most incredible thing I've ever seen. And then after that, we drove to a military cemetery in Lviv, where we made a film, and where the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of freshly dug graves, all individual graves with photos, people, flags, it just really brought home the cost of it all. My last question is, with the media, which we have serious issues with, and with political narratives, are we really at the point now where the losses are so great that the narrative changes from them being lives and individuals and turning into statistics, and really allows people to park their thinking and really not engage with it as a subject?
Yeah, I think it's very, very important for everybody to remember and to focus sometimes on the individual human being, the mother with the children, the father coming home, the lack of an income all of a sudden because the father is dead. All these individual people make, all these individual drops of water make the ocean. But the wonderful thing about the Ukrainian ocean is they actually believe in the direction they're going. Psychologically, they're powerful, they're strong, they believe in the war, they believe in the fight. And so I think that, you know, they're creating a powerful movement that is going to continue no matter what the Russians do. On the other side of it, you've got people that don't care about life. They don't care about human stories, and they don't really care whether they win or not on the soldier on the ground. And they're losing 5 to every 1 of the Ukrainians. And that's got to catch up sometime in the next generation. It's sad, but it's also the nature of war.
That's a very, very powerful and poignant place to end there. I strongly, strongly recommend people read not just your previous books, but of course, Slava Ukrainia comes at an absolutely critical time. I encourage people to read it and then not just sit back and feel a sense of doom and despair. Write your MPs, get involved, point out how important this is, put pressure on people so that they read materials, watch videos, and educate themselves, and then go and take action from that. And that's something you've done consistently through this. And I know that's why you've built such an extraordinary loyal following. And it's never been more vital than it is now. So Robin, thank you for your time on the channel, and thank you for everything you do.
There's just one thing I'd like to say. It's not available in the bookshops. It's available on Amazon all over the world. And if people want signed copies, go to my personal website, robinhorsfall.com.
And we will put a link to that, of course, in the description of this video. Robin, thank you very much, and Slava Ukraini.
Harajem Slava.